Great if folks would go ahead and take a seat, and feel free to move to the front. We want to make this a pretty conversational, comfortable space. Panelists, please take a seat. Great, so this is going to be a little bit more of an informal session. I think some folks were able to attend the panel last night. We've heard bees and neonics mentioned several times throughout presentations, even this morning. So I think we've got a bit of a primer on the issues. But we'll spend a little bit of time digging into the issues affecting bees and pollinators as a whole, specifically spending some time focusing on neonicotinoid pesticides. My name is Paul Towers. I'm the Organizing and Media Director at Pesticide Action Network. I'm based in California. We're part of an international network that works to advance socially just, environmentally sound solutions to hazardous pesticides. And we're part of this broader coalition of many of the groups here, nationally Beyond Pesticides, the Oregon groups, based groups, Xerces, Beyond Toxics, some great antenna, Beyond Toxics, NCAP, among others, that are working to create safe places and sustainable solutions to protect pollinators. As many of us know that pollinators, and specifically honeybees, have become a bit of a canary for what's broken in our industrial agricultural system. And so not by addressing the problems facing pollinators, by addressing the problems facing bees, we begin the task of unwinding, of fixing, of mending what's wrong with the larger agricultural system. And we know that that can't be done overnight. But it can be done with a lot of the tremendous work that's happening here in Oregon, with a lot of work that's happening in other states around the country. And so we're here today to talk a little bit about where what the problems are facing bees, where the science is at, that not every bit of evidence is in, but we've heard about the preponderance, the weight of the evidence that's with us, and about what the opportunities for action are at the local, state, and federal level. So we've got a great set of panelists. I'll go ahead and read some of their bios. Actually, it's right there. And then we'll go ahead and dive right in. So we're joined by Pierre Mineau. He's a world-renowned environmental toxicologist who co-wrote the report, The Impact of the Nation's Most Widely Used Insecticides on Birds. Dr. Mineau is an emeritus senior research scientist in the Science and Technology branch of Environment Canada and an adjunct professor in the Department of Biology at Carleton University and the Department of Veterinary Biomedical Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Mineau, who's no longer sporting his antenna, is also part of an expert working group under the European Authority for the Revision of European Guidance on the Assessment of Pesticide Risks to Birds and Mammals. We're also joined by Mace Vaughn. He's the Pollinator Program Director for Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, NRCS Pollinator Conservation Specialist, and co-author of Attracting Native Pollinators. He has been a leader in conserving bees in agricultural landscapes for over a decade, spearheading a team of specialists working to bring habitat and pesticide protection to farms and gardens across North America. He earned his master's degree in entomology and education from Cornell. He has taught a wide range of audiences across the U.S. about the conservation of bees and other beneficial insects, and has wrangled insects for 2 PBS Nature documentaries. Quite a feat. Ame Code is the pesticide program coordinator at Xerces, previously employed with Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, NCAP, based here in Oregon. She has more than 15 years of experience working to protect people and the environment from pesticides. During her career, her efforts have protected low-income families from exposure to pesticides through her promotion of integrated pest management, IPM. She was also an integral part of securing federal protections to reduce pesticide contamination in salmon-supporting waters from Southern California to Northern Washington. Most recently, she was part of the coalition that passed legislation in Oregon that guarantees pollinator protection training for pesticide applicators and established a task force to examine issues relevant to pollinator health. Ame received her Master's of Science in Environmental Health with a minor in toxicology from Oregon State. And finally, we're joined by Jen Hornaday, and the co-founder of Healthy Bees Equals Healthy Gardens, which educates the community about how to maintain healthy, pesticide-free environments that allow bees to thrive. Their persistent and attentive community activism that has produced real reductions in how and where certain pesticides are used in parks and natural areas throughout Eugene. They also worked with NCAP to organize volunteer workdays that help keep parks maintained without pesticides, and they partnered with other local beekeepers in a campaign to get businesses to display cautionary signage alongside pesticide products that are known to be harmful to bees. So we've got an amazing panel, obviously amazing biographies. We'll go ahead and spend about 15 minutes of presentation per panelist, and then we should have plenty of time at the end for folks to ask questions. So we'll look for that to be a bit more conversational, but we'll go ahead and kick it off with Mace.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. And just so we can get a sense, I just want to see who was able to join us for the presentations last night. Okay, so it looks like who was not? Good. Okay. All right. Well, Pierre and we're going to do a little bit of a back and forth here. We do want this, with a smaller group like this, we want this to be an informal session where you all are able to sort of engage. And Pierre and I last night we said we're going to go a cappella on this, working without a net in terms of at least in our case, slides. I think the format that we wanted to sort of share, I want to kind of give you a roadmap for, I think, how we're going to roll things out today. So you've got a sense of where we're going and kind of how we're organizing this. I want to make sure that the people who weren't able to join us all last night have got a chance to kind of get up to speed on, especially on what we know about neonics and how they work and these sorts of things. But the way we thought we would do that is to have us sort of roll out a story and talk about what happened last year here in the Portland area at Wilsonville around this big bumblebee kill, and use that as sort of a platform to understand to a certain degree kind of what is going wrong and what are the risks, how these different products work. And so I think Pierre and I are going to try to do a little bit of back and forth where I'm going to sort of share with you that story, kind of how it rolled out, and then I think he and I will sort of trade back and forth, have him talk a little bit more and give you some details as to, what it means to spray these different systemic chemicals and kind of how that ties into bigger issues. And then we'll be able to roll that into kind of, all right, well, what's come out of that event in terms of, say, national policy, state policy, and sort of that leads us into kind of where do we go from here. So that's our roadmap. Does that seem fair? And then we'll sort of dive down and get sort of more local as we go through our panelists. So I think, actually, so I know, how many of you did hear about or aware of the bumblebee kill specifically in Wilsonville? Oh, okay, so I'm saying, all right, pretty much everybody. So for the few of you who haven't heard about this, about a year ago, actually, June 16th, last year, yeah, June 16th, Xerces over the weekend on a Saturday received probably 5 rather frantic phone calls to our office of people saying, oh my God, I was just shopping at this Target in Wilsonville. And Wilsonville is a town, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes kind of south out of Portland. At a Target there saying, there are bees raining down everywhere. And you get a call like this, and you think, oh God, this sounds awful, but you're not kind of sure what to do. Do you send somebody out? But you get 5 calls like this from 5 different people. You want to know what's going on. So we sent our colleague Rich Hatfield out that Monday as soon as we, almost as soon as we got those messages. And he called back in the office to say he's never seen anything like it. Literally, this parking lot under the trees were carpeted with dead bumblebees or dying bumblebees, just spinning around on their backs or walking around in a dazed sort of way. And the sort of thing that people were noticing. I mean, obviously we got these phone calls, but it was noticeable. And what was in this parking lot were about 55 linden trees, basswood trees. These are these beautiful ornamental trees that are frequently planted in our cities. They produce prolific nectar, actually not so much pollen, but prolific nectar. And in fact, for beekeepers out there, this is I think personally the best honey in North America, but that's a bit of an aside. Coming from New York, where wild basswood trees can be 80 feet tall, it's a big honey flow, it's delicious. In any case, so we got these phone calls, went out there, investigated. I actually happened to be driving to Corvallis the next morning, so I stopped at the parking lot at 6:30 in the morning the next day to see people sweeping up the bees and trying to clean things up because they were so prevalent. And at that point, actually the day before, we had contacted the Department of Ag. So we started this process of getting the state involved to come investigate what was going on, because this was no little backyard kill. I mean, this was something significant. And ODA, the Department of Ag, Oregon Department of Ag, happened to have a team in Portland that was driving back through, and they collected some samples and stopped that evening on their way back. And pretty soon we had an entire team from the Department of Ag coming out and questioning. So that was Monday. We had that first investigation. Tuesday I stopped. We collected some documentation. By Wednesday we had Oregon Department of Ag out there looking at what was going on. And by Thursday we had the city of Wilsonville looking for solutions. And I should have used one slide to show what ended up happening, but the result immediately was that the city, the landscapers involved, the Department of Ag, Xerces Society, and by the end of the day, Friday, 4 other cities and 4 other landscape companies had recruited over 100 people, had bought $15,000 worth of shade cloth and staples and things like that, 12 boom trucks, and had literally, in a day, covered 55 trees, netted 55 trees to try to block these bees from visiting those flowers. I mean, it was an astounding, what was interesting for me was an astounding community event. You know, we had 6 Xerces people, 12 ODA staff, all these people who volunteered and who came in. And it's kicked off a reevaluation, in Oregon at least, of the use of these products and what can go wrong. And what went wrong in this case is that a landscaping company had gotten reports of aphids pooping honeydew down on cars, and came in and sprayed these 55 trees at full bloom with a product that the label not clearly states, but the label says you're not supposed to spray this on anything in bloom. And stemming from that, we have this sort of this engagement of ODA, worried about what's taking some actions. They immediately posed a ban on the use of these products, particularly dinotefuran, which is the chemical that was implicated, and said, okay, we're doing a 6-month halt on this to do this evaluation, to do our investigation, to figure out what was going on. And subsequently, for this year, ODA has banned the use of these products on basswood trees in the state. It's just for the 2014, but it's a sort of a step in the right direction, and gets at some of these issues that we need to be paying attention to, which are numerable. Perfect. And I think we could talk some about in terms of policy that sort of emanates out from all of this. As a result of this, Earl Blumenauer, our representative here for this region, we've got him involved, made sure he was in the loop on what was going on, and from that came Saving America's Bees Act, and this bill that he put out there promoting a moratorium on the use of these products while we figure out how do we deal with risk management and better understand what's going on. At the same time, it kicked off a whole sequence of events in Oregon looking at how can we prevent this from happening again in Oregon, and evaluating what some of those policy options are. And in May, we'll talk about some of those policy implications coming out. Hold on one second. Yeah. And so there are these pieces that this kill really helped focus people's attention, get into motion. And what I'd like to do, that's a sort of that's a real rough sketch of sort of what went on and kind of big picture, what led from that. Pierre, if it's okay with you, I think what I'd like for Pierre to talk about is just what the use of these products on, why they were using these particular products and what that meant for sort of those trees, how these worked broadly or...
Yeah, except I'm not sure in that case. I mean, the trees were in bloom. So, I think it's likely they could have had similar impact with a whole range of different insecticides.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But I think what I'd like for you to talk about is maybe what could we expect this year?
Right. Well,
I think that is my mind is sort of, because 2 months from now, what might we see 2 months from now?
Yeah, it all depends on how much of the material got in and will be retranslated.
Yeah, but I guess if you could give some background.
Yeah, so I mean, for the few people who weren't there last night, I mean, and I don't want to repeat a whole lot because most of you were there, but we've been focusing on the systemics and specifically the neonicotinoid family. For several reasons, and one of those reasons is the inherent hazard of these compounds. I mean, I described it last night as the perfect storm, in the sense that they are exquisitely toxic to a large number of invertebrates, be they aquatic, terrestrial, pollinator, or non-pollinator. So they're very broadly toxic to insects. They do well what they were meant to do. But they are systemic. They're extremely water soluble, and by systemic, I mean you can apply them to the roots of a tree. You could apply them on the ground as a drench, and they will be sucked up through the roots. We have, it could be a tree growing on the edge of water canal. The canal is contaminated. The tree will pick up the residues, and it will go up and be translocated into various tissues, and some of those tissues will be pollen and exudates like nectar that pollinators will be seeking. There is a certain amount, and we were just discussing that before. This is Susan Kegley's out there on the, my co-author on last night's presentation. And step in, Susan, if you have anything else to say. But being a systemic also means I think there's a higher chance that a material that is translaminar that goes into the plant tissue from leaves, as would be the case here, will be translocated within the plant. How much of it is stored and comes back up the next year, depending on how much actually hit the ground and how much was retained by the foliage, I'm not sure that there's enough data to really predict what's going to happen this year. It'll be interesting. I would say maybe cover 49 of the 50 trees, leave one uncovered so that we could at least get those answers and maybe take some samples of nectar and pollen. It is as well, yeah. So it doesn't, so absence of problem there doesn't mean that it couldn't have happened with clothianidin, for instance.
Yeah.
So the fact that they're systemic does bring that whole context of exposure. And the fact is not just, as I described yesterday, there are a lot of products that were systemic before. The organophosphorus dimethoate is systemic. There's a number of systemic products. But what is really special with neonics and some other insecticides is also their degree of persistence in the environment. We've gone to, it's funny, and it sort of comes in cycles. We went with extremely persistent compounds with the organochlorines. Then we got the very sort of relatively short-lived compounds with the OPs and carbamates, and they were affecting children's developments and weren't working anymore. Now we're back into very persistent compounds, and you have compounds with half-lives which normally, we were just saying under the Stockholm POPs Convention would raise a few eyebrows, because the whole intention of the world was to move away from chemistry that was that persistent. So it's the factor, the combination of persistence and systemic activity that is really, and exquisite toxicity, that is really problematic with this class of compound. The other thing that the increased persistence does is that it ensures that the material is there all the time for surface runoff. So typically, your typical agricultural scenario, you apply your chemical, and then if you're monitoring for it downstream, then you wait for your first rain. First rain comes along, and you see a spike in the water. And that spike goes up, and then usually pretty quickly goes down as the water flows down. And then it will rain again a few days or weeks later, and you get usually a smaller spike and a smaller spike and a smaller spike. And what you have now with these compounds is these spikes tend to be maintained and as high from one sort of rainfall event to the next. So you have this sort of constant loading of material into receiving waters, and that's what I'm quite concerned about. So any vegetation on the edge of that water will be picking it up, as I said, trees and so on and so forth. So that's a real concern. And stepping back from that whole picture, where we have these materials, the systemics, persistent systemics that are in the fields and virtually all of the fields for some crops. The wider question is that is this really where we want agriculture to be going? And do we really want to throw out the millions of dollars we've invested in IPM research? Because this essentially, for some crops, is what we're doing now. We're saying we don't need IPM because we're treating all the time, whether we need to or not. One of fundamental tenets of IPM. So I think those are the main points, and what makes these compounds so problematic and special.
I would add, and I would just to stepping off from that, one of the challenges I think that we're facing as well. I mean, we've got these broad ag landscapes where these repeated prophylactic doses are being applied at low enough levels that we don't see, boom, an immediate bee kill. But what's interesting for me is that approved uses for ornamental landscapes and ornamental plants, like we saw in Wilsonville, are significantly higher. 60% higher, 100%, 60 times higher, 100 times higher are allowed. In fact, are on the label instructions, at least for the analysis we did, comparing, let's say, an apple tree in Pennsylvania to a crab apple tree, or really an apple tree in your backyard. What's described there in terms of application rates can be, as I said, 60, 120 times higher than in agriculture, which sort of leads to my concern where we're sort of managing around let's say EPA is trying to manage around an acute problem. The challenge, of course, is managing around sublethal problems. But in an ornamental landscape, which I think Amay and we'll talk about a little bit more, all of a sudden we've got a situation where these application rates can be hitting this acute level and can potentially be a problem. And so maybe this would be a good time to segue for Amay to talk about some of the policy issues coming out of the, sort of where we've been working in Oregon, if that seems appropriate. Yeah, I'll take a. To my knowledge, the question was, were the Wilsonville trees sprayed prior to this application? And to my knowledge, I'm pretty certain no. There were other bee kills in the area, particularly in the Hillsborough area, that were on-label treatments, so they had followed the label instructions. Those trees had been treated 3 years in a row. With a trunk spray. So it was this spraying onto the trunk, and then it moves through the trunk into the plant, into the tree, and then up. And that's where we saw it was a much less intense bee kill, but there were hundreds of dead bees under those trees. And so in that situation, we did have this repeated application at, that was on label. Nobody made a mistake there, technically speaking.
So that was on the same trees?
No, different trees. That was a different.
That would kind of mess up the scientific part of the.
Yes. No, this was a completely different event that, because of the attention garnered by what we saw in Wilsonville, had people reporting to ODA, incidences all around the Willamette Valley.
Is anyone tracking bee populations this spring?
Yeah.
That is a very good question. Oregon State University has been very interested in this. We did an analysis with some colleagues at the USDA's Ag Research Lab, taking the bees that we'd collected from that parking lot, and we do know, based on a genetic analysis of those bees, I can't remember the number, on the order of 200 to 300 colonies were affected. The estimates that we came up with were about 50,000 bees were killed in that site. And we're thinking at least 200 to 300 colonies. They represented 200 to 300 colonies to come back and then document. I don't know of any plans to do that. It would be really nice. I'm actually more concerned about not more concerned. I'm equally, if not more concerned about what's the residues in those trees, and if OSU is going to come back or the state's going to come back and collect do some residue analysis on that. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. There may not be very many bees, but
If you see fewer bees, you don't know whether it's because they're not being killed or whether it's just that there's not very many bees.
yeah, and in that case, we have no baseline to say what are what the bee numbers. I mean, it's an interesting landscape. There's crimson clover fields nearby, a natural area nearby, a beekeeper nearby who I doubt will be bringing his bees back to that area for a little while. But maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Amay.
Well, I've been charged with talking about the policy solutions. And as you guys can gather, this is a huge problem. This is an issue where these are chemicals used in nurseries, they're used on the farm, they're used prophylactically, they're used in our backyard. So I'm going to talk about a sliver of the problems that we're dealing with and a sliver of the possible solutions. And as I look around the room, I see a lot of other people that have a lot of other ideas about solutions. So I hope that this conversation kind of grows and we learn from each other and expand. So I always have to start with the reality is when you're working in pesticide reform, a huge part of our work is making sure that the ecologically sound alternatives are there for people to use, and making sure we've got research for it, making sure we've got people on the ground training and working with the folks that are dealing with pest management. And Xerces, NCAP, a lot of the groups that are involved here work on that on that issue. When we're talking about neonics, they are so under-regulated that we're not just talking about outreach. We absolutely need regulatory solutions. We need to create regulatory changes. Mace mentioned Saving America's Pollinators Act. This is the baseline. This is really, this is what we need. This is what we want to have happen. We know there's a problem. We don't understand it fully, and these products need to be removed from the market until you find out if and how they can be used safely. And that's what this bill does. It takes a step back, puts these products on a timeout. We know there's risk, and we can't use them until we can figure out how they can be used and if they can be used safely. There's also a lot of really smaller solutions, short, small steps that we can take, hopefully that can move faster and that still make a big difference. Maybe it's at our local level, it's at our state level. And that's what I want to focus on. What are the blatant problems that we have, and what are some really concrete solutions? Mace mentioned this really quickly. This was shocking to me. And I also tried to, so one of our pollinator specialists at Xerces did some calculations on the rate of application, the active ingredient, not the product, the rate of application in a backyard in comparison to agriculture. And she looked at apple trees. There's a lot of variables, okay? It's not just what do you apply at this and what do you apply there. What's the diameter of the tree? How many trees per acre? Is an applicator knowledgeable and going to apply less than the labeled rate because they know it's still effective? So there's a number of variables, so she did multiple calculations. But at a minimum, we're looking at about 12 times more active ingredient. This was a look at imidacloprid products. 12 times more being applied to a backyard in comparison to an ag tree. You take that out and you look at a worst case scenario, 120 times more being applied on a backyard tree. I mean, no matter who you are, I think you can be a really moderate blue dog Democrat or even a Republican and you can get that that's not right. Something went wrong in the regulatory system. And I think we need to make some policy recommendations. We need to move on this. Backyard rates should be brought down, at least to compare with ag rates. And Xerces has reached out to Oregon Department of Agriculture. ODA has reached out to EPA. There is a little bit of momentum for this movement forward. So more momentum will be great. We got to keep that going. It's a small solution, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So taking a totally different angle, here's another possible policy recommendation or a problem that we have that has some policy solutions. As I said, these chemicals are severely underregulated. And when they came on the market, they were streamlined into use because they were considered reduced risk compared to the organophosphates. A lot of the testing that would have been done wasn't done. So most of these neonics are general use. And probably a lot of you recognize there's a lot of energy right now to train our pesticide applicators so they know how to protect pollinators. And we can have a debate on that issue as well. But there's tons of money going into that. And the irony is a huge number of people that are applying these pesticides for pay are not licensed. They are untrained, unlicensed applicators because, for two reasons. One, because they're general use pesticides. Now, but even a general use pesticide, if I'm an applicator and I'm applying on somebody else's property, a general use pesticide, I still need to be licensed. But as one State Department of Ag employee told me, but if you're an employee of a nursery or of a farm, it's like applying a pesticide in your own backyard and you don't need to regulate. So therefore, if I'm an employee of a nursery, and that was actually what he said it's like in your backyard. Because I remember that quote, it was kind of took my breath. If you're an employee of a nursery or an employee of a farm, you don't have to be licensed to apply these pesticides. And a backyard is very different. I mean, you can't say these are commercial products, likely a lot more intensive use. So I really think there's a solution here that people can get behind, where if you're paid to apply pesticides, you need to be licensed. And I've talked to a lot of folks who think this is also a workers' rights issue. You know, people need to know, they need to be trained and need to understand their rights and how to keep themselves safe. So that's another angle, a very different angle, but another thing that we can be looking at here because of the fact these are some of the few insecticides that so many commercial products are general use. So this really brings us back to Oregon, and this brings us back to what the tragedy of last summer. You talked about basswood. They're also tilia or linden, lots of different terms. But the reality is those teas, they have a moderate toxin. They produce their own toxin, and ODA, Oregon Department of Agriculture, saw that when you added, well, I should take a step back. So there was the one kill in Wilsonville. There were actually 3 other incidents that happened in Oregon this last summer that were reported, probably many more that we don't know about. There's 2 things in common in all of those incidents. 1, it was a use of a neonic. 2, it was to a basswood or a tilia tree. So the Department of Agriculture here said, wait a second, there's enough of a risk if you're going to put a highly toxic neonic on a tree that produces a moderate toxin. That's enough to cause a change in how we're going to regulate. And so ODA basically said, condition of 2014 registration, you cannot use these pesticides, 2 of them, dinotefuran and imidacloprid, cannot be used on tilia trees, basswood. I think there's momentum there. I think we can go a lot further than that, hopefully. That's something that other states could adopt. We could have that happen. That's something that we could expand beyond this year. We absolutely should. It's something the conversation should be had. Is it just imidacloprid and dinotefuran, 2 of these systemics, of these neonics, or do we want to include other chemicals as well? And I also kind of, maybe this is almost its own policy option of its own, but one other question is, so it's prohibited to use them on tilia trees this year. What other plants could these pesticides be applied to that also would create a high risk for our pollinators? And I think something that Xerxes has been talking about is there's a high risk when you're talking about forage plants, bee attractive plants. So maybe we need to consider prohibiting the use on some of the key bee attractive foraging plants for our pollinators. So those are that's my narrow look at a few problems and policy solutions. And I've got one question just really quickly. Oh yeah, okay.
I was really wanting to know what the animal was that was getting sprayed, and I just was not, it was aphids. Were there really aphids in the trees, or were the trees just dripping sap?
They might just have been dripping nectar. I didn't see very much evidence of it, that I could tell were from aphids. I certainly saw no aphids.
Resistant aphids?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I apologize.
Yeah,
No,
no,
it's
sure.
okay.
I saw very little evidence. I mean, it could have been that by the time I got there, 3 to 4 days afterwards, they were all gone. The leaves certainly had residue that looked like honeydew on them, but basswood trees kick out so much nectar that it's sort of hard to tell. So, very hard to tell.
I'm sorry, I wanted to know which animal was getting sprayed.
Yeah, aphids would have been, were the primary.
Well, honestly, even whatever animal it was, the reality is people didn't want things dripped on their cars. And so it's pretty, but just really quickly just to wrap up, I think, there's a lot of other policy options out there. We have Lori Ann, who works at Center for Food Safety, and they just came out with some really interesting discussions around prophylactic use, specifically in seed treatments. So there's a lot of other policy options for us to be exploring as well. So anyway, and I think we're going to move on to the local. Success. We get to hear success now.
Hi, y'all. I'm Jen Hornaday with Healthy Bees, Healthy Gardens, and I hope I'm a little bit underdressed for the event today, but I'm really trying to help the bees out here, and I think it's really important for people to know, right here, the antennas, we are being aware, and I'm a East Coast, highly sensitive, energetic Gemini, so I get out there and I try to do stuff. I'm just, not the quiet person sits in the corner, and I may overspeak sometimes, and people may not like what I have to say, but in general, I just have a big heart, and I care too much. And I'm trying to educate people to care a little bit more than some do. So it feels really great to be here in like-minded space with people who really do care about the future. And being an educator for the city of Eugene, I work with young people a lot, and with the Healthy Bees, Healthy Gardens is just a wonderful way for me to be able to go into the schools and donate my time to work with the second graders, third, fourth, and young people. And I always start out with, the pollinators. What is pollination, and what about these bees? I'm scared of them, they sting me, and, from really to understand that right now the fruit trees are flowering and we need those bees to pollinate so we can eat the apple and all the fruit. But for them to realize that at the end of the cycle of plants like lettuce and broccoli and kale and those little yellow flowers, we need to leave part of that plant for the bees and for all of our pollinators, because at the end of their cycle is when they do their flower. Instead of just yanking that whole plant out of the ground or going to grocery store and seeing that whole head of lettuce, in my gardens, I always take half and leave half. And, I have that for them. And, after that little yellow flower, then there's a seed, and that seed may drop on the ground, and all of a sudden I'm going to have a new plant there. And I don't see anything wrong with that. So as far as, keeping everything healthy and organic and starting for that space with these young people to understand that is, really using the bees to say, if we don't have these bees, then we don't get to eat. And, to keep it as simple as possible. I mean, the stickers and the signs that I've designed, keep it as simple as possible for people just to really understand the reality that bees really are responsible for every third bite of food we eat. And all the pollinators in general, the little tiny mason bees that don't get, much knowledge because they're only out for a little bit of time, they do so much. And so these little critters, these furry little guys that look like teddy bears sometimes. My grandfather was a beekeeper and was also an orthopedic surgeon, so he was helping people at Mass General at a base level of helping these really amazing people, and then in his spare time, he played in the garden and had the bees. And so lucky I've got him as a spirit guide with me today to be able to pass that on to others. And things that we can do is we're happy in our yard and we're organic, and that's great, but to really get the confidence to speak to your next door neighbor and not just over the fence, I don't agree with your green grass, but to really, say, why is your grass, a weird kind of green, and why do you realize that your pet is licking its paws and my bees are in your yard and that's my pet and I'm unhappy about this, and what can we do about this so we can share the land? Because, from that plant, it goes into the soil. And I've heard that some of the systemic tree pesticides out there can stay systemic for up to 7 years, and that just breaks my heart. And I talked to people yesterday at Lori B and Eugene, where people are picking up bees, and last year I had beekeepers, every single year they come through, it's just a write-off for them to buy that $100 box of bees, and then they go home and throw it in, the bees do their job, he makes his money. And they say, what's the big deal? And I said, well, on my Honeybee Friend Pledge, it says, please refrain from using all pesticides and, chemicals, and that is Roundup and Weed and Feed. And he goes, well, I have to use Roundup. And that was his sentence. And I go, well, you have to get bees, and you have to use Roundup, and they don't work together very well. And it's a business write-off for you, but it's so much more expensive to have to have someone with a strong back dig up those plants that you don't want between your rows of plants. So as far as me, it just doesn't make sense, how can we work together? It's so much easier and for people to go into the store and to see something on sale, those rows with a pretty rose on it and a pretty blue plastic bottle that's really easy to go home and just pour down on the ground. And then when I talk to people that has gone systemic up into that rose, and when you sniff that rose, you're sniffing a chemical, and when my bees, come in contact with that pretty flower, they may drop dead right there. If they don't do that, then they fly around and get disoriented and confused and may not make it back to their home. And if they do finally make it home, they're going to bring it into their home and kill their family. They can't just go up and say, okay, it's kind of stinky in here, let's move. So as a beekeeper, straight out grassroots, I have to take out the wax. This is only third year doing this, so next year I'll be taking out, every year I look at them and to see if anything's a little bit darker. Last year I did see a bee that was doing the upside down dance and flying around in circles, and it just broke my heart, and I was trying to follow that waggle dance of communication of where that pesticide was coming from. And I'm like, tell me more, I'm gonna go get them. And, you know, what can I do about this now? And didn't know, and I was like, I'm so sorry, and, you know, tried to collect it. And then 2 months later, my husband was picking blackberries down the street and, you know, had a whole bucket from one neighbor and went over to another. And then he saw something down the ground that was a discoloration, and he was like, oh my goodness. And he went and talked to the neighbor. He goes, oh yeah, I use some Roundup out there. I was like, really? Well, I've just been eating those blackberries. Oh, well, you shouldn't do that. You know, and I was like, now there's yellow and black / cross marks across there, and here his poor wife has cancer, and now he's on an oxygen tank, and he may not make it. And I don't know if that's karma 1 year later, but, you know, it really is so sad for people. The bottom line is they're uneducated, and so if we can just educate them to what it is they're doing, and why do you buy that on sale instead of the biofish fertilizer in a brown box? You know, this is so much better than this, and to educate them and show them that, you know, if there's a neem oil or, you know, hot vinegar or something that we can put down there to be able to take out the things that we don't, you know, like, or to be able to just hire that healthy gardener, then the gardening company that wants to help take care of the yard that people like it to be in a healthy way. Other things we can do, we've got the organic pollinator gardens that everybody knows that that's what we can put in, and, you know, next to all of the other bushes that you have, throw in some lavender, throw in the phacelia, the aster, those bloom late and forever, and sunflowers. I love my sunflowers. They go, I'm a sunflower gal and a honey girl, and, you know, the crazy chick that lives on the corner, and, you know, whatever else they want to say. And I'm also the park bitch, because anything that happens in the park, I am out there. What's going on? You know, and when I planted 25 native Oregon trees there 5 years ago, you know, they are doing great because the city only mows the park 2-3 times a year. But then a couple years ago, they wanted to put in a salmon restoration area. That sounded awesome until they started, after they were done with the park, they were just dumping all their rock in the park and ruining my trees. And the park guy go, mind your own business. It's not your land. I'm like, okay. So they kicked me out of a garden that I had there for 12 years, and we're not going to go down that path because I'm a little bit disturbed about that too, because it was just an organic garden that anyone could help themselves to, that I built for the community. But this balance between what we can do and the yays and the you know, where is that happy medium on what we can do and what I deal with on a day-to-day in Eugene. After that salmon restoration was built, then all of a sudden I saw a little ankle-high pink or green sign saying possibility of spraying within this month. What does that mean? You know, and it's an ankle high. Who can even see that across a 5-acre park? And until I saw someone out there with a big backpack and a big truck with this huge nasty stuff in it, oh, what is that? And I was like, well, my bees are out here right now, and you are spraying this blackberry plant that's crowded around a snowberry that they are loving on right now, and they are bringing that food home to their family. And he says, well, it's not bad for bees. There's been any proof that it's been bad for bees. And I was like, have you really done research? And he's like, no. And I was like, well, you're breathing this stuff too. I don't see you with anything on your mouth, but I now have a headache, and I'm just tossing the ball for my dogs, and I think that I need to go inside now. But how long is this pesticide going to be in my world that you're just going to spray and leave? So one hand doesn't talk to the other. So they're spraying in the salmon restoration area, which they created for a good reason, but then the city has to take care of these invasive species that possibly may be there now that they've created this habitat. So so it's a real interesting cycle of what I deal with. We got recognized last year for the Rachel Carson Award for creating these pesticide-free neighborhoods, so a little bit more about that. I've got paperwork there, and so there are good people out there that want to help the bees and want to know more about that. And so the Honeybee Friend Pledge, basically it's just committing to not using pesticides and chemicals. And so we've gotten 5 blocks now of people that we've gone in and we've said, someone says, I want a hive at my house. All right, so we walk 4 streets around their house and talk to all of the neighbors, and once everyone is committed to not using those pesticides and chemicals, then we brought a beehive to their house. And then I care for those bees. I had 13 beehives that I had last year, 13 amazing flavors of honey that is so unique. And people ask, well, how did you get your bees to get this flavor? Well, they're my friends. They go to healthy spaces and they collect all the fruit and pollen and all the nectar and bring it on home, and they create this amazing, flavor of honey that's not just the clover or the linden or anything like that, but it's all unique in its own way, and we've won awards. So that is super cool. I still am continuing to do that. We're at the space right now where there's people that want hives, they call me up and want a hive, but then when I explain to them that it costs $500 out of my pocket to be able to build this very special home for the bees to live in, then they back up and go, oh, well, I was gonna buy your $2 sticker. I'm like, that's so nice of you. However, I'm the one caring for these bees, and I'm creating this very special home for them, and so I appreciate that you have a wonderful organic yard, but there has to be some monetary hello, thank you for the bees, because they are pollinating your whole neighborhood. And that would be wonderful if I can continue to do that with some monetary support from the neighbors in that community. So there's also a breakdown of that. And my latest sentence to someone on the phone just last week, I said, we don't just buy a horse and throw it out to pasture. I said, there are responsibilities, and that is my responsibility for my bees, the children that I have, to be able to care for them in the best way that I possibly can. So that's more what I want others to continue to do, and I appreciate you guys for having me up here. I'm sure I've got more on my list that I could talk about, but tell them Sluggo is good. It's got the picture of the cat and the dog on the back. The Sluggo Plus they just came out with last year. It's got a ladybug on it for organic gardening. What's that about? It's got the nasty green pesticide in there that kills more bugs. It's Sluggo Plus. It's supposed to be better, but it's not, because it kills more bugs and kills the bees and kills more things that people are unaware of. But they don't know that. So talk to your neighbor, your friends, your family. Have that strength to get out there and spread it, because it starts with the education. And then they all speak from their heart. Do you want your pet, your children, and everybody to be breathing that, drinking that? Clean air, clean soil, clean water forever, please. So thank you for having me here. And
Great. Thank you, Jen. What a firebrand. And what Jen didn't also mention is, and I think sort of it's come out in a few spaces, is, Eugene really has been at the cutting edge of, working to protect bees, passing one of the sort of preeminent policies just in the past few months that would protect bees and restrict the use of neonicotinoids. So just powerful work. Jen and others have been part of that, and just exciting to see what's happening in Eugene that hopefully can be carried forth to other communities throughout Oregon and the rest of the country. So we're excited about that. We're actually moving fine on time, and so I actually wanted to leave it to any of our panelists if there's any other thoughts you wanted to share before we drive into questions, because Pierre, you didn't fill up all your time. So,
Yeah, I guess one is a question and is a comment. Just how important are urban refuges now for bees and other pollinators? I mean, there was this story going around a while back that hives on buildings in the middle of Paris were doing much better than the hives that were out in the agricultural land. I thought, well, this is true. That speaks volumes. So that's just one sort of question to the bee people. And then on a sort of the policy front, the other thought I had is that I was at a very depressing conference a few years ago when somebody was going on and talking about all of these sort of, organized gated communities that are springing up as the population ages all over your country. And mine too, I'm sure. But I think the gated community phenomenon is actually quite strong here, and you get places like Florida, and it just seems to be one after another after another. And they were saying that essentially the homeowners there had absolutely no choice. When they moved into one of these places, they had to sign a covenant that they would not only maintain their houses and paint these colors and whatever, but spray their lawns, spray their bushes, and basically keep it in this sort of immaculate, sterile way in which it was intended to be. So on a policy front, and especially with the number of people aging and this presumably proliferation of nonsense, I think that's got to be tackled first.
When I would to work from the your second question backwards. I think what's interesting from my perspective is, sure, you've got these gated communities with these neighborhood covenants that you're supposed to follow. But still, I mean, for years now, if you let your front yard kind of grow wild, the city will come and harass you. And that's, you know, in my mind, even a bigger issue. Because you're apparently then harboring rats or whatever other vermin might be in there. And it's interesting. I do think that that's something that increasingly people are aware of, which is encouraging. And increasingly people are moving on coming up with programs to do things like urban meadowscaping. In fact, Portland has a Portland urban meadowscaping program that's helping people do things like create wildflower meadows in, you know, your front yard or your backyard, which is very encouraging. And in my mind, I mean, in an urban landscape and a suburban landscape, the key in my mind is that things need to look purposeful. So if you take and have a wild, overgrown meadow, but then you get your lawnmower out and you mow a very nice border around it, looks very formal. It's like totally ragged with wildflowers, maybe some shrubs in it, but then you put an edge on it that says, look, this is on purpose. Actually seems to have an impact, not just in urban landscapes, but farm landscapes too. I mean, the farmers that we work with, they don't want the farm to look tattered and disorganized, even though I give them the excuse that if you let things go wild in the back 40, for those that still have a back 40, that's having multiple benefits for all sorts of pollinators. But if you've got, if you just put an edge on it, put a sign on it too, an edge and a sign, so that people understand that there's a purpose for this, then that education happens and people know that you're not just letting things go wild. So those are the non-policy approaches that a number of folks are sort of working towards. But I do think that there needs to be a better understanding of the value of, you could call it naturescaping, you could call it letting dandelions grow in your front yard. I'm planting a bunch of microclover this weekend to have that as part of my lawn, et cetera. To answer your first question, I think is an easy one. I have no idea. I used to, and this idea of, are bees in urban landscapes doing better than bees in rural landscapes? And I think it's just a really hard one to get at. Anecdotally, for years, there was conversation that, oh yeah, the urban bees seem to be doing well, but here in the Portland area, beekeepers got hammered this year. And sure, we had a couple of cold snaps, but anybody who's a beekeeper knows that, bees are adapted to deal with cold snaps. Certainly there's the cold here is nothing like upstate New York, where I hail from and where I learned how to keep bees 20 years ago. And so I don't feel like we have a clear picture of that. Sure, anecdotally people say that urban landscapes can be better, but you could have so many different hot spots of pesticide exposure that I don't know of any studies. Now others may. Susan, you may have insights into that.
Marianne Fraser give a talk at, Marianne Fraser's at Penn State.
You can come on up.
Yeah.
Please.
So Marianne Fraser is a bee researcher, entomologist type at Penn State, and she just came and gave a talk to the Marin County Beekeepers Association meeting a week and a half ago. And they did a study looking at urban hives and pesticide residues in urban hives. In Marin County, which is pretty crunchy, a lot of granola there, sorry, and they've banned all pesticide use on the roadsides. They don't use herbicide sprays on the roadsides. There's a little bit of farming in Marin County up north and west, but not a lot. Mostly organic. And then they also did the city of Pittsburgh. So they worked with a beekeeping organization there. And they found not too much in terms of residues. They found the one that they found most often is bifenthrin, which is in almost everything. The biggest use of it in urban areas is on turf as a grub control agent, and it probably on turf, grass, lawns, and things like that, golf courses. And so if there's anything blooming growing up in that, you'll get it in there. And then they also found, of course, some of the miticides that are applied inside the beehives to control the varroa mite. Those were the biggest ones. Yes.
Does anyone have any experience using the oxalic acid? I need to get advice on that.
I don't. Anyway, so that would be that. Basically, the urban bees look pretty good. You also have another confounding variable, which is new people in urban areas are learning how to do beekeeping. And I'm a new relative. I've been doing it for 3 years now, and you make mistakes when you first start. You do stupid things. So we may be getting through some of that as people ramp up and get up to speed on doing beekeeping. And so is the survival because of the pesticides? I mean, I had 2 out of my 3 hives completely die this year. I sent them out for analysis. It wasn't pesticides. So I spent a lot of money on that. But and it was the cold because I was running a top bar hive, and they were all in the bottom of the hive, just dead. They weren't gone. So that they didn't have the symptom of, quote, CCD. But I would attribute that to my lack of expertise in doing beekeeping. So there's a lot of variables. But the data that we do have from an area that is low pesticide use, and probably Pittsburgh is maybe moderate. I'd love to see it done in
Pittsburgh, so watch yourself.
Yeah. It's not like LA, right? Or one of these gated, or Florida.
Paris. So when you were in Paris, did you find out, I mean, I'm sort of interested in the losses, the hive losses. I mean, urban environments will be warmer. So if cold is an issue, you have the microclimate issue of a warmer environment. If there's enough food source, I mean...
The people I was staying with in Paris, they love the bees. They love the outdoors. They've got this beautiful patio garden and everything. And she also has some pesticides, and they were sitting by the side of the hallway, and as I would walk past them, I was like, it would be rude to look at her pesticides. But I did. Anyway, and in green plastic bottles. They look green, healthy. Acid amiprid, imidacloprid. And I told her that, and she was like, oh, this is horrible. What am I doing to my bees? Oh, this is horrible. So, people don't know. And, there's an education gap there that's a real problem. So.
Pesticides, you said you got pesticides on roadside spraying. The county, how they do that?
The Marin County folks are pretty hardcore.
Yeah. I think some might even be in this room. That was long. It was, organizing a campaign to restrict the use within the county. I can connect you with the right folks. Yeah.
And Paul, just quickly
Yeah.
as well, one of the speakers later this evening is going to be Pete Sorensen, and when I was at the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, I worked with him as a county commissioner to also severely limit, and actually at this point there are no more herbicides used on our roadsides in Lane County as well. So and Thurston County, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, other than the weed board and invasives, there's the issues, but there's always someone has a loophole somewhere. But there's a lot of people.
Because I actually sit on that board.
Nice.
Oh, great. So we have some. It sounds like we've got the opportunity, and we have some good examples and folks to connect you with. So I think we're going to move on. I just wanted to add one thing, Pierre, to your second question, which are around these homeowners associations and these areas. Again, I think the education is important, and we can't forget, and this is spoken as an organizer, that we can't forget that those are bodies oftentimes that have boards, they're entities that make decisions, just like we're talking about with roadside spraying, that if you can get a group of people together, get your voices heard, you can get the types of changes you'd like to see. And so working with folks in those communities to change the bylaws of the homeowners association so you can't apply neonicotinoids, or you do organic lawn and land care, those types of things are very possible, and we've seen that happen in many homeowners associations in these gated communities across the country. So I think there's a lot of good examples, a lot of energy there, and it's about getting groups of people, getting to know your neighbors, as Jen has talked about, to build that effort to see the types of changes you'd like to see. So we've got another 20 minutes or so for some more questions, and we can keep this as a back and forth with panelists, and folks can jump in and answer questions as they like. I want to make sure we have plenty of room for everyone to ask questions. Think back there, and then we'll go here.
Great. So in the Willamette Valley this winter, we had a lot of landscape plants die from the unusual cold. So as a homeowner, when I go to replace those, how do I know that the landscaping plants I'm buying haven't been treated with
You want to answer?
Yeah.
Should we let Susan answer?
extensive organic garden I have.
I think the way, there's only...
You want to answer up here, just so you might get.
I can answer that too.
I mean, there's really, to my knowledge, I mean, really, the easy first answer is to look for organic, to buy organic shrubs and organic trees to replant, to look for those, to look for nurseries that are going to supply that. And those I don't know how commonly, I mean, it's the Willamette Valley, should be doable. I can connect you, if you go to our website actually, and go to our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, we list nurseries from which you can get plant materials through, it's for the Pacific Northwest, but you can look, there are several in the Willamette Valley. And from that list, you could pull people and call those people and say, do you have organically grown trees and shrubs that I could use to replace what I've lost? And that would be my first and the first and most straightforward way to move forward on something like that. To ask for that. Otherwise, it's a matter of when you go to a specific nursery to ask them. And I feel like what we're seeing across the country are increasingly people asking those questions, and nurseries kind of scratching their heads around. Nurseries I see nurseries in two groups, right? There's the nursery you go to buy plants, and then there's the nursery that actually grows them. And so if we look here in town, we've got a local nursery that sells plants called Garden Fever, and they went and contacted every one of their suppliers to get a sense of, okay, are you using these products, so that they had a sense of what was going on, so they could tell their customers and ideally begin to get plants and make sure that the plants they were selling weren't going to be treated with those products, especially those that were actually flowering, that bees would visit, to make sure that they were helping their consumers address it that way. So those are my two answers. Jen, I think you've got a couple thoughts
Yeah,
too.
thanks. What I do is in Eugene, the grocery store that I was at last year, Fred Meyer, I was just walking by to grab my essentials, and there was bees all over this cool plant right outside. I'm like, oh, I haven't seen that one recently, and then I'm like, okay, are these bees being healthy right now? Are they choosing and they're making smart choices right now on this plant that they're eating because they're excited about these flowers? I just took the tag right out of the plant, and I picked up my smartphone and I called them on the phone and I said, what do you guys use? And then everyone was, and 3 days later, I got the communication from the person in the nursery and said, we used to use some unsafe products last year, but we have gotten rid of those safely, and now we don't do that. So that was really cool in a good way to hear that, but to speak right to the horse. And then I also spoke to the store owner and managers and said, do you put anything into this soil product before you sell it? Because that's what we're learning is that Lowe's and Home Depot and things like that will have that. Yeah, it's in the soil mix that they put in there.
That's not quite true.
No.
I looked at it, and basically it comes with a packet. Sorry.
It's not that they mix it in with the soil. They sell you a bag of soil and they sell you a packet. That's the Bayer 3-in-1 advanced tree and shrub, whatever, and you just put that packet in the planting hole. Because I was worried about that too, and I was like, okay, I haven't seen this before, and it's not
That's
exactly the soil.
interesting.
So
Yeah.
as long as you
Well,
don't rip the inner lining, you're okay.
yeah. Well, I was told also that in two of the gardening companies here in Eugene, Down to Earth is very cautious about that. But then there's another one called Grays, which I don't know if that's legal to say that, but they will put some pesticides on their organic plants so that it doesn't affect their other plants they have in their store. So there are stores that will do that sneaky under the carpet. So that's right on for myself. This is what I do, as a homeowner and a healthy gardener, that I want to know straight from the two sources, where it comes from and the store itself. And so we're also educating people to go into their store and to talk to, like we did at Jerry's and Home Depot. We've gone and spoken to these people and said, walked around with our signs, please be friendly. This is all I'm saying. Please don't spray is my other sign. And, all I'm saying is please don't do it. And, can you at least put the stinky stuff in the back? And at Jerry's, they do that now. And I had, a not be safe sticker that I said, this is what I want to give you to be able to put on your products. Can we do that? And they were hurrying us out of the store and yelling at us, you can't be here, you're disturbing our people. And we're like, we're just trying to educate. We're not trying to cause a fuss. We know you're making money off this product, but we live here too. And we do shop at this store. We want to continue. So can you help us out? So at Bi-Mart and Jerry's, we have had some goodness come out of that they've put up some education flyers there. And I just got a note from Lane County Bee Association that there is something at Bi-Mart. I haven't been in to see it. And I said, good news or bad news? Because I got an email from one of the beekeepers to say, go look. So, I'm hoping that that's. And then last thing I wanted to say, too, as a bee lover and for everybody that doesn't like yellow jackets, to put up those rescue traps. Those are a natural yellow plastic trap. They only cost $10, and it has the queen pheromone in it, and that will attract the queens now. And if we are able to collect the queens now, we are just doing away of so many of the problems later on in the season. Apparently, when the yellow jackets are born, they have enough of the colostrum and whatnot from their mother that they're all good and they're happy. But then when it gets hot summertime, they become these nasty, mean carnivores, and they just will, grab my honeybee out of the air all filled with backpack pollens, and then will grab it to the ground, and 6 of their buddies will all shred it and just have this huge feast. And it's just disgusting. They will fly into the hive, and they will, grab anything they can, come out, and you'll see when I pull out the little trap at the bottom, do a mite check, I will see bee legs and wings, and my poor little girls are getting shredded in their own home.
Is that the Japanese one, or is that just regular?
No, it's a regular yellow jacket.
Yellow jackets, not pollinators.
I don't think they are. I don't think there's much good. That's good. That's good.
Okay. Yeah, I do need to stand up for the yellow jacket. So you're absolutely right. Yellow jackets are a pain, and I do think that where you're nice, well said. Exactly, and in an urban environment, my mother-in-law, that's a huge hassle in the summer, and I get that. I think you're absolutely right. Treating your backyard early to get queens before they establish a nest is a good way to avoid having to then spray a nest later. So I think that's right. Well, I'm just to deal with the nest later. But they are beneficial insects that are critically important for, cabbage looper control, aphid control, soft-bodied insects. Sure, they'll occasionally eat bees, but that's actually relatively rare. They're mostly eating caterpillars and things like that. They're actually doing a ton of work in organic farms and gardens and are incredibly important for that reason. So that's critical. People need to understand that. They do pollinate, not a lot. They visit flowers to collect nectar only to fuel the adult flight. So that's important. And so they do move some pollen around, but they're not very hairy. But they are part of biocontrol. There are beneficial insects for our gardens. So we need to balance, managing them at our backyard where we're cooking salmon on the grill, and their value else in other places. So I just want to put that out there.
Scraping the size of your house is away.
Oh yeah, they help clean away anything that's oxidized. That's another story. You can find. But go ahead.
One good piece of news on the garden front is that if you go to the Home Depot Eco Options page, Home Depot's starting to respond. So last year we did this report called Gardeners Beware, where we worked with the Friends of the Earth to analyze plants from nurseries, from Home Depot and Lowe's, the big retailers. And it was a pilot project, so relatively small sample size, but we found about 50% of the samples that we tested had neonics in them. So, and everybody started, like you guys, all started bugging Home Depot and, pushing the buttons, right? And of course the people at the local stores don't have any power to make those decisions, but it went up the chain and things are starting to happen, at least at Home Depot. Lowe's has completely ignored us. But so.
Yeah, and I would actually, as a quick follow to that too, one of the things that, other actions that are sort of in motion right now is to make available, for example, looking at the seed treatment issue in corn. And if we just take corn as one example, where basically your conventional corn seed is all treated, there's a big backstory to that, but it's pretty hard to get untreated seed. So we've been working with some of the seed suppliers out there to be able to actually provide an conventional untreated corn seed that's the same high grade, all those things that many of us have issues with, but the seed that people want addressing this issue as being non-treated, to be able to promote it as sort of a bee-safe corn to be able to plant. And the reason that can happen is because of people coming in and asking. Even in a non-confrontational way, just to come in and ask the question and to sort of have you as a consumer be part of that has an impact. And as people increasingly are educated and understand that, okay, we're seeing these major issues happening worldwide at this point, this is a thing that people can do, and it's having an impact right now. And we're trying to create that infrastructure so that ultimately we could have a bee safe or bee safer corn product that people could have on the market. So.
I want to go back to the queue. I saw Fritzy, Catherine, and then we've got a couple here.
I am on Wolf Day, so I'm very sensitive to a lot of these issues. I don't know if you all know about Wolf Day.
Very well.
All the pesticides that were discussed last night have been used by the aquaculture industry, and I have become very sensitive to the issue regarding invasive species. And already today, you mentioned it, and you mentioned it in a very interesting context because you mentioned it in terms of salmon habitat restoration. And actually, my colleague and I, Ginny Daly, we have an article that is in the about salmon habitat restoration, because one of the things that I've discovered is that habitat restoration has become an excuse for going after invasive species. And you know, you mentioned it, Amy, you know, all of a sudden it's okay to go after invasive species, so-called invasive species, and there's a whole other thing about it. But what I'm hoping is that the environmental organizations can begin to look at themselves and look at this issue in a new way and realize that basically when you go after, you have to be very careful, because you've got a huge chemical industry that makes a lot of money on this invasive species issue. And so I'm just pleading with you all to realize that every state has a noxious weed board, and things get taken up politically to get declared to be a noxious weed, and then you can do whatever you want with them. And basically it is spraying. And I was at a noxious weed board meeting, and a woman, they were trying to do blackberries, wild blackberries, which were declared a noxious weed. And a beekeeper came up, she said, I don't want this to be declared a noxious weed because I know what's going to happen. They're going to start spraying it, and it's going to impact my bees. So I'm just saying, you've got to get out of this habit of looking at a plant and thinking of it as an enemy.
Can I add a little on invasives?
Yes, please.
You know, invasives is such a difficult issue because it puts environmentalists against each other. I want to protect habitat, and these invasives are taking over. The ivy is here, whatever issue, you know, it's kudzu, I mean, the list goes on. I want to protect my environment. I don't want you to use chemicals. And there's a clash, and it's so hard. And one of the things that I found that, that I try to talk to people about when I'm talking about reducing pesticide use, when they're talking about invasive control, I start talking about the links. I mean, Willapa Bay, so she's from Willapa Bay. Right now, they are using herbicides to get rid of what they think of as non-native eelgrass. And one of the natural controls for eelgrass are ghost shrimp. Well, guess what they're using insecticides? Actually, they're using imidacloprid is what they want to be using into the future. Carbaryl is, yeah, they're no longer using carbaryl, so they have, you know, this special permit, and they're doing imidacloprid, and they want to get a formal permit. So guess what they're using? They're going to use imidacloprid to kill the ghost shrimp, and they're using imazamox, is it right? Imazamox, yep, they're using imazamox to kill the eelgrass, and guess what? The ghost shrimp would be controlling the eelgrass. So trying to think about, you know, the guys who are out there trying to protect ecosystems and restore them, they get the diversity and the cycles that we're talking about. And when you start talking to them about how pesticides are breaking up natural cycles that are helping the restoration, sometimes you get somewhere. Most of the time, people use words of war to discuss invasives, and that's a real societal change that we need to change how we're talking about plants, beneficial plants in many ways.
And evolution.
Yeah.
It's really nature. Nature's
Anyway,
not
there's a lot more.
Thank you for bringing that up. Catherine, I think you're next.
So I had a question about a program that you briefly mentioned last night, which was the work with the USDA and the NRCS to roll out a sign-up program for bee habitat, especially, and we've seen it in the upper Midwest being rolled out. Beginning, I know that you've done a lot of work to ensure that native pollinators, you know, native plants that are bee-friendly, pollinator-friendly are part of that program, which is incredible. And I'm wondering if there are opportunities within that program to bring the pesticide issue up in a slow and less political way. For example, could the farmers that sign up for that program be required to use non-neonicotinoid seed? Or could there be a buffer zone around those, you know, habitat areas that could address the pesticide issue, and that there begins to become a buzz on the ground, so to speak, between farmers that are using non-neonicotinoid, you know, treated seeds as part of this program? I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this is, for those people who don't know, this is specifically a $3 million program that USDA has rolled out, that the NRCS is managing to create honeybee habitat in 5 states in the upper Midwest, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I have been very deeply involved with that whole process and the design of that. When we were first meeting with the state technical staff back in December about how we would roll that out, those questions were sort of at the forefront of a lot of what we were talking about, a lot of what I was pushing on. In January, I rolled out a national technical note for the agency on how to think about bee safety and IPM to, in theory, create a framework for them to work at the state level, ideally, to incentivize adoption of bee safe or bee safer pest management plans and integrated pest management. As we built the habitat piece of it, all the technical folks on board, we were mandated, okay, we want habitat. And so we're like, okay, that's the first tier. That's what we're going to roll out this year. But as we built that, we put into the program in the ranking criteria, habitat is only going to be allowed to be planted if it's 75 feet away from a crop edge. If to be able to get some sort of a pesticide-free, have some sort of a buffer to deal with some of those drift issues. It's not perfect by any means, but certainly everybody was engaged with thinking about how do we minimize the pesticide risk as part of it. And going on, in my conversations with folks in DC, as well as at the state and regional level that we're working, part of what we want to be able to move on is have some sort of pesticide protection as part of it. So that's certainly the hope. And the agency as a whole, that's my goal in working with the agency nationally, is to create more of those opportunities. And right now, the holy grail for that, in my mind, is working with the state of Iowa, where you've just got cheek and jowl agriculture across the whole state, most of which is this corn soybean plantings. And Iowa State University is, to their credit, are really trying to think about this bee safety, and the state NRCS office is incredibly engaged. And so we're working right now to kind of work with them and ISU, Iowa State University, to kind of begin to get these plans together and try to come up in the next year or two with some sort of an infrastructure that could incentivize, as you say, sort of a ground-up adoption of practices. Pull-in crop scouting, et cetera. And then if we can have untreated seed available, for example, we can begin to have these things mesh in a way that works for growers and helps guide them into this process. So we're working on it, and we're certainly doing our best to try to have those policy issues kind of move forward. That's a No, people pretty much recognize that pesticides are a huge risk, and that, there are a number of studies ongoing with the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Minnesota in those same landscapes. I talked a little bit about this last night, clearly demonstrating, to be published, but early results seem to be clearly demonstrating that if you've got this landscape that's where the preponderance of the landscape is bee safe, so there's not as much row crop agriculture, that those bees are better able to survive and kind of purge themselves of what they've been exposed to as they went through almonds and berries and et cetera, as they kind of move through the landscape, not to mention just what beekeepers are putting in their hives to layer on top of all this. It's a very sort of murky waters, and to have that clean habitat seems to be an important way to help hives kind of strengthen themselves up to be able to cope with all these stressors. Yeah, Pierre.
What's the relationship if you stack a whole bunch of hives into an area like this into a refuge? What does that do to the wild bees?
Okay,
there's competition there.
This is the question that comes up frequently, and certainly one where the Xerces Society has pretty significant concerns. And in my mind, the way we look at landscapes, when we're looking at, let's say, natural areas, hive or two is not a problem, but there's clear evidence about disease transfer between honeybees and bumblebees. There's emerging evidence, especially when forage and habitat is a limiting resource, that there can be competition, et cetera. And so the way we're approaching this topic right now is that in an agricultural landscape, we really need to raise the core foundation of habitat and pesticide protection to really elevate and support all these bees. They're all part of our agricultural systems. They're part of supporting. They're supporting agriculture, and plus it's an important industry. And I love honey, and that's important.
Right. But does that mean that along with that should come some sort of stocking rate, much as we do with cattle and good pasturing?
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of data on stocking rates and what's balanced. I wish I had sort of good information on that and good details on that, and I don't. You know, I worry about 48, 100, 200 hives being dropped into a natural area and what that might mean for wild bees and other pollinators in that landscape, which is why I think we want to try to elevate and create more of this landscape across the country, and where, in my mind, the upper Midwest is a very important place to focus because it's such a heavily agricultural landscape, because there's a lot of CRP land. This is the Conservation Reserve Program, so these are ag lands that are being sort of taken out of production and set aside where we can really create habitat at a grand scale, and 65% of bees, give or take, honeybee hives, end up in that landscape, in that area in order to, you know, produce honey and kind of rest up to get ready for the next year. So it provides a really, I think, important laboratory for increasing honeybee health within the managed bee community overall. And so that's why I believe it's important for that we're focusing energy there to be able to create this sort of robust system to be able to support that without and minimizing these chances of competition, disease spread, et cetera, in some of our natural areas where the management goals for those natural areas is biodiversity overall. So that's sort of my philosophy and our approach and kind of where Xerces is coming from on that. Yep.
Great. Well, thanks. Actually, we're actually at time, and so I don't think the conversations need to end now. You're welcome to grab panelists and continue over lunch. We're actually headed into lunch now, so feel free to snag folks here. I'm sure folks have business cards and other things you can connect with afterwards. And great information and reports up here on the table as well as upstairs in some of the rooms. But let's give our panelists a round of applause. So we learned a lot today. We learned a lot about bees, the challenges they face, opportunities at the local, state, and federal level to plug into, and a little bit of insight into what bees face and what that means for our larger agricultural system. So hopefully you can take that back to your places and let us know if any of us can be a resource. So thanks to all of you.